am a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight is part 2 of our Occult and Crochet on Israel Regardie. Hit the little subscribe button, I really appreciate that. Like the video if you're into this kind of history of occult and spirituality. Also drop any comments as we go if you're on the live stream. If you're watching replay, leave them in the comments section. Any of your thoughts, if you've read any of Regardie's work, or if you have had the, if you're old enough to have ever had the chance to have met him, which would be so awesome. Anyway, I linked part 1 in the description of this video. If you haven't seen it, you can hop over there and watch that. Otherwise, we will... I have a really weird thing going on here. Just a sec. Okay. Otherwise, we'll just plow ahead and get started on part 2. So, when we ended last time, we kind of went through how Regardie got into the deeper aspects of the occult, and a little bit of his time where he spent with about 1.5 years, 2 years under the guidance, if you could call it that, of the wickedest man alive, Aleister Crowley. And he was just starting to get interested in publishing his own work. So, that's where we're kind of starting off now. After leaving Crowley's employment, of course my notes are all over the place tonight, just one second. Try to get them back in place. Actually getting his first book published in 1932, and in my opinion, this first work is a foundational work for Kabbalah in particular. Oops, just one second. I have a few of these books with me, so I was making sure that I had them here. This first work that he did drew upon previous occultists, as in Aleister Crowley, Eliphas Levi, A.E. Waite. And that was actually The Garden of Pomegranates, which is one of the few books I don't have with me. If you have never picked up this book, or if it's something that sounded interesting but you're not really sure, this text in particular explains, in very understandable language, the very complex system of symbols of the Kabbalah, and it's a work going through the Tree of Life. It's explained in a way that a beginner can understand it, but it can also take a practitioner who's been doing it for a while into a deeper aspect of the Sephira. And what's interesting is Israel actually dedicated this book to Crowley. The other part with this book is it goes through the 10/11, and if you read that book you'll understand why I say that, of the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. It also explains the 22 paths of wisdom, which are the connecting energies between all of these different paths. It just lays it all out in a very understandable way. And when I first started studying into ceremonial mysticism and magic, I ran across the Tree of Life and Kabbalah. To be 100% honest with you, if it wasn't for Israel's work, especially with this book in particular, I would not have been able to grasp those concepts, because he writes it so that you can understand it, and if it's something that you want to incorporate into your life, he makes it easier. Most of the modern day texts that he wrote are edited and annotated by Schick and Tabitha Cicero, and they have actually expanded, but they were in really close contact with him for the last few years of his life, so they expanded on what was in the texts, but it was under the guidance, for the most part, of Israel himself. So, because I feel like it's great to talk about them, but to be able to just go down and be like, oh, there it is, because some of these may not resonate for you. But after he finished the Garden of Pomegranates, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the Kabbalah of any form, Israel followed this work up with a primer on magic called The Tree of Life, a study of magic. And I happen to have that one right here. This volume dives deeper into the practice of magic and some of the various aspects of different practices. Most everything in this particular text rotates around the Golden Dawn, practices within or practices that are associated with, but it also dives into a little bit other of the work. He also does a really good job of understanding and kind of deciphering some of the Hebrew languages, but the base chapters sections, and they do an interesting thing with the way they did this, because the Ciceros also did a little of adjusting, not of the text but of the layout. You can see in the index here they do a part 1, so these are kind of your introductory stuff, and then he goes down chapter 1, mysticism, magic, and yoga. Then there's a whole different branch. You can look up exact locations for each one. Chapter 2 in the defense of magic art, kind of going through the kind of thorns and arrows you may get when you start practicing if you are open about it. Chapter 3, he goes into the Kabbalah, breaks it down into a whole bunch of different ways. Then he goes into like astral light, man is the microcosm, then the gods. That's just the first part. The second part, theory and practice. This is where you start to get into the deeper, and I kind of ascribe to it, that to work ritual of a lineage like this, you need to actually have the tools and understand the tools to be able to work it properly. People today will, oh, well, I feel that this is the right one. And that's fine in certain crafts. Not so much this one, just heads up. But he goes through the correspondence, the tools, the techniques, training the will, vibration of the god names. And if you are new to vibrating names of power, definitely read that chapter, because it changes how you deal with the spiritual. Scrying, astral projection, assumption of god forms, sacred magic of Abram Malin. He only goes through the basics. He does not actually go through the entirety of the ritual. The entirety of the ritual I did do a book review on, so you can check that out in their life. He goes into some of the grimoires, how to do evocations, initiation group rituals, theurgy versus spiritualism, black magic, alchemy and the Mass of the Holy Ghost, and prayers, hymns, and invocations. And then they go through and do an entire section on the symbols, as well as other works. That these books are not small. They read quick, I will give them that, but just this one alone is almost 500 pages long. It's huge, but it's definitely worth the read. But that was his second book, but it's a primer. It gives you an overview of what you can work on if you choose to take this path. He did serious, but it's something that you actually have to understand if you want to be received by hosts of the magical and occult community. But there was a segment of the occult that were very not happy about him sharing what they deemed occult secrets, and the Tree of Life was the one that they were the most pissed off about. Kind of the meat of what we're going with the theme here. This led him to actually contact the Stella Matutina, which is a branch-off group of the original Golden Dawn, and during this time in the 30s, the official original group still continued on. They still had the rituals, and they still had a lot of the original documentation from the three founders. So when he was inquiring into this, it was because he wanted to deepen, and he knew what they had done with the Golden Dawn, and he really wanted to understand it more. And What is interesting is Crowley still held massive sway in the occult community, so when Crowley to find out if this was a good match or not. And not so much odd, but to me it was a little surprising considering Crowley's beliefs on how to. So that was pretty cool. But this also gave him a little bit of a buffer against the people who were hateful towards him for the moment. Things don't always go so well in the opening of his life. Israel took on another name with this initiation into the Stella group. He took the name Ad Majorum Adonai Gloriam, which means to the greater glory of Adonai, which is Adonai, which is to the greater glory of the highest aspect of God. Second highest aspect, sorry. Yahweh is the highest. Since he had a good foundation in magical practices already, thanks to his work with Crowley, he ascended the ranks very quickly within this group, eventually achieving Zelator Adeptus Minor, which, to those who don't understand, as I've talked about before in other episodes with Golden Dawn, you have the outer court and the inner court. The Zelator Adeptus Minor is the first level of the inner court. So this is a fairly high rank of initiation. The founders of the Golden Dawn worked his way up the ranks in a very short period of time. The only person who did it faster was Crowley himself. And Crowley claims to have actually achieved Ipsissimus, which is the highest level within the Golden Dawn, in 3 or 4 years, which was obscenely fast. We'll go into him later. It was at this time that he became a little bit grandioso titles. Not far unlike the leaders after Woodman, Wolcott, and Mathers had kind of stepped away. The leaders of the Golden... The ego is a tool, and when you let the ego rule, you become the tool. So, and that's what ends up happening with some of this, is where it goes. It's the ego gets involved and collapse. Excuse me. Stella group, that he made an interesting choice. A choice that is great for us, but for him at the time was an absolute nightmare of something to do. And what he did, he decided to break his vow of secrecy to the Stella group, and he began to publish the Golden Dawn's rites and rituals to keep them from disappearing completely. He saw where the group was headed and was like, I did link this one, I have not read this yet, but it's called My Rosicrucian Adventure, or What You Should Know About the Golden Dawn. Because to him, there wasn't a lot of difference between the Rosicrucians and Golden Dawn. Oh, stop dropping frame rates, you goofy thing. Why is my internet being bad? When he wrote this book, it was kind of an expose on those in the upper echelons of the occult world. It goes over the Rosicrucians, it goes over the Masons. It wasn't just a Golden Dawn Lodge expose. He went out, he basically blew the top off of everyone who was in one of these lodges at the time. Can't imagine that going over spiritual journey and their art. Israel's literary work brought him very little in financial help. Not that it wasn't being read, it just wasn't being read by everybody. He expanded his interests during this time, and he started to study, familiar with these names, but when I started looking them up, they were really big in Carl Jung line psychology at the time, and that is E. Clegg and J. L. Bent. And although he felt Jung was right in most of his theories, and that one of the big things he disagreed with is the concept of introverts versus extroverts, Carl Jung's views were pretty black and white. Regardie's like, there's more to it than that. So, I mean, it's little things like that, but it made him stand out, and he started studying Christian mysticism. Not sure where that came from. basically using the biblical texts as a magical formula for expanding the consciousness to the spiritual. He was specifically attracted to the writings of Francis of Assisi, and this is where he started to use his first name of Francis, section of his life. In 1937, Israel decided to move back to the United States after his adventures abroad. After sending Crowley one or two of his recent articles, Crowley started to mock the use of the name of Francis. Started calling him Frank and Frankie and just kind of being ignorant, which when something didn't go Crowley's way, he wasn't always the nicest person. And this started a little bit of a fight between the two occultists, name-calling and letters that attacked each other. Israel was so upset by this interaction that it is said that he stepped completely away from mainstream occultism. In my personal opinion, he stepped away from the public side of things, which is private. Part of the reason I believe that is he kept writing. I mean, you can write the stuff without actually continuing to practice it, but the intensity that he wrote with in some of his work tells me that he continued to practice, just not with a group and not publicly. Even though he stepped away from the primary spotlight, he did not stop writing, as I said. In 1938, he published a work on alchemy and psychology called The Philosopher's Stone. I have these all piled. This one yet? I've gotten started in it, and the reason I haven't fully gotten into it yet is, why are we dropping frames? Because it's a YouTube thing, not okay. Is he uses this work, how do I put this? He uses psychology to explain alchemy, and he claimed later on in life to hate this work, saying that his understanding of both subjects of the time was massive, and it was edited and annotated by the Ciceros to kind of clear up some of the misunderstandings with it. This process of alchemy during this time period when he wrote this book, which was in 38. So he'd only been probably practicing 2 or 3 years. When you practice alchemy a decade and you still know this much, and I'm not kidding. It is such a this other thing he'd only been studying for 2. Both are lifelong practices, so I can only imagine as he got older, he was like, what was I thinking? You were young and you had vibrancy. That's what you were thinking. But a lot of issues with it just in general. And I'm hoping this is recording properly, and if not, we'll figure. Israel originally published. Over the years of 1938, this is another one of his writing journeys. From 1938 to 1940, he published 4 total volumes, all on the Golden Dawn's rituals, rites, writings, and essays. It was compiled in its current form in the 1960s by Llewellyn Publications. This book right here. Get the reflection off of it. In this text is all of the rites, the initiation practices, to get started in the Golden Dawn at home. Now, they do recommend setting up a temple, but it's not like you're going to have to do that. The tools, yes. Temple, no. It's an amazing primer on this line of magical thought and practice. It is very detailed, and I mean very detailed. This one in particular is not quick or easy to read. I am 3/4 of the way through this one, because there's that much information in it, and it's not something you can just sit down and be like, oh, I want to light read. No, the original people who developed this were trying to develop something that would trigger the psychological responses, bringing you. This is the most complete version of these rituals and rites that exists. I will say that there's one newer version of it linked in the description. There's a few other people who have added their experience to the work, and it has taken this 800-page tome, massive work. I can only imagine more intense that one is, and one of these days I would like to get a copy of it. I don't need another duplicate copy, but that particular work I would like to just compare. So there's that. This is the one that really got him hatred, loathed, actually. The violation of his oath of secrecy to the Golden Dawn through the Stella Group made Israel one of the most hated men in the occult world. He was on par with Crowley for the hatred, because inside the occult world and outside of the occult world, they started to hate him. Some even went so far to curse him, but he knew more than most of them did, so it wasn't like it was a big deal there. He could repel their curses. Even Crowley got on the hate train, even though Crowley had done the same thing by exposing the Golden Dawn rituals in some of his own work. And there's stuff in there that's not it's almost word for word what Regardie has and what some other authors going back even further wrote. It's like, calm down, Crowley, you're just mad because he did it better than you. And this is one of the few places that I will say that. Let me try something real quick and see if this doesn't stop this. Say that we were disconnected. Just 1 second. Sorry. I'm not great with the technology just yet, so we're working on this. Well, it says we're still alive. So, well, I guess we'll see. Either way, after the hate train with Crowley and the rest of the occult community, Israel's Golden Dawn became a classic that has influenced many individuals and groups to this day. There are people that will straight up say that they have a direct line back. There's certain ways to tell, and I'll go into that in a minute. But if they don't start with this book, they have no connection to the original group. Just, that's kind of cut and dry, unfortunately, because there were 10 levels within the group. There's not 33, that's Masons, there are 10. So if you are hearing people talk about being a Golden Dawn member 23, they're not in the original Golden Dawn, they're an offshoot and a branch. Literally, if they do not use most of what Regardie taught, then they're really not Golden Dawn. They can call themselves that, but they're not the original vein. Anywho, back to the man we're speaking of. Israel turned his attention more strongly to psychotherapy after he published those 4 texts. He dove into the work of one of my personal favorite people, Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was the man who discovered orgone. He was also a psychologist, and he was a whole list of other cool things. You can check out my website, mysticjanmara.com, and I have a little mini biography of orgone on there, including information about Wilhelm. And check that out. See if there's an orgone there you like. Yes, shameless plug, no regrets. Israel graduated from chiropractic college, which this one threw me. You went from psychology to chiropractic, which, cool, fine, but this really, when you read through a lot of his histories, this pops up out of nowhere because he was focused on magic and psychology, and then there's like this little blip that pops up. He graduated from chiropractic college. Huh? But he did. And he graduated from the Chiropractic College of New York in 1941. It was around this time that he also saw what was going on with World War II, and he joined the United States Army from the years of 1942 to 1945. Which, again, mad respect there. Once he was out of the Army, he did return to his psychology interests, and finally achieved his doctorate in psychology. During this time, he also felt led to publish 2 books specifically on healing. The first one was Be Yourself, The Art of Relaxation, and the second was The Art of True Healing. This was the first time he published... This was also the time that he published another occult manual tied to the Golden Dawn called The Middle Pillar, The Balance Between Mind and Magic. This book's focus is primarily on the one exercise, which is the middle pillar exercise. It is simple concept, and I will not say that it's not. It is a simple concept. It's a lot like the chakras, so if you're used to the chakras, you will understand this easier, but you can still pick it up pretty easy. But he takes you from just doing rote words without a lot of emotion behind it, and he creates the ritual. Now, he didn't create it, but he deepens your knowledge into it. He talks about how to adapt it to other practices, how to expand this exercise to a full tree of life working, and to me, this ritual, on its face value alone, can be an entire spiritual ritual on its own. It can be an amazing way to raise energy for ritual work. It can be used before a healing session for yourself or others. It can be done daily, which is actually recommended. And Israel does an amazing job of detailing this ritual, and the Ciceros have helped bring this into the modern age, because some of the old wording in it, because they do leave their wording, and there's sections where they'll like put the square brackets, and that's where you know that's an addition to it. But he breaks down each and every location of the Sephira through the body. He talks about the different angels that are associated with different Sephira of the body, how to manipulate the light once you get it built up. And the purpose of this is multiple fold. You're working energy through your body, so you're clearing out and opening all of your energy channels. You are bringing in massive spiritual energy. You're basically creating the light body double, which aids in astral projection, which once you understand this and practice it a lot, you'll notice that you can project much easier. So it's worth looking into for that. Again, when you start getting into the more ritual aspects of mysticism, a couple of things happen. One, the willy-nilly do whatever feels good stuff stops, because when you start working at this level, you're elevating pretty rapidly, but you're also working with forces that need to have structure so that they don't overwhelm and take over you. That's the reason when I talk about stuff like this, I always put that caveat: make sure you're ready for it and follow the rules to start. Once you start getting more comfortable with it, you can rearrange things as needed. But when you're working like Kabbalah, Golden Dawn, ceremonial stuff, you definitely want to understand the ritual before you start tweaking it. Just a little FYI there. So, this particular area of interest did lead Israel to financial success. The chiropractor work, the psychology, and then the publication, oddly enough, with the the middle pillar, is what kind of launched him into a more financially stable area of life. During this time, it was said that he actually started making 80 grand or more a year, which is impressive considering this was late 1940s. That's significant. That's like, several $100,000, if not $1 million in today's dollars. He publishes another book during this time, and this one is on New Thought and Christian Science, and it's called The Teachers of Fulfillment. Personally, I had never heard of this book before, so I have no idea what it's about, other than what you can read online. It was originally titled The Romance of Metaphysics, but they changed the title because that didn't quite fit what was in the book. And this is kind of like an overview of the big leaders in the New Thought and Christian Science movement. Mixed reviews, but did sell a lot of copies, is what the original one. Now you're seeing it's usually got like 4-star review, because it is pretty intense, or in depth, not intense. It was also during this time, around 1947 or so, that Israel moved to the state of California. In Los Angeles is where he set up his chiropractor practice, and he was primarily a chiropractor. But to some of his clients who kind of knew who he was, he would offer psychotherapy and Reiki and healing techniques to bring them into higher states of healing. He also would teach psychiatry at this time at the LA College of the Chiropractic. Not exactly sure how psychology ties into that, other than I do know there is a lot of links between emotional releases that occur during massage and chiropractor. So it's an interesting crossover, and I'm wondering if it's not because of, the emotional stuff that comes up when you're in those situations. He kept up his writing, and he contributed fairly regularly to Psychiatric Quarterly. I don't know why I struggle on that word. And the American Journal of Psychotherapy. He knew what he was doing, and he was good at it. And what's interesting is I never put these two concept practices together until I read a lot of Regardie's work, because ceremonial, complex magic or mysticism fall in line with psychotherapy, almost like they're twins, like they should be practiced together. You don't have to be a psychoanalyst to practice, but when you start to understand the psychological impacts that this kind of work can do, it's good to at least have a little bit of an idea, read a couple of books type of a thing, so that you can process some of the changes, because it will bring up things you repressed or didn't even realize were going on. When you work ritual, ceremonial type mysticism, magic, Golden Dawn, you're not just peeling up the corner of a band-aid, you're tearing the whole thing off, and then you're taking the next band-aid, pulling it off at the same time. It can be a little intense. So, and that's why they kept a lot of this stuff secret, is you had to go through a series of tests to find out if you were mentally okay. Doesn't mean you're stupid or anything else, but you have to be mentally ready for the emotional stuff to boil over, because it does come up. There's times doing some of this stuff over the years, yeah, it gets a little intense. We'll just go there. Anyway, but we're not talking about me, we're talking about Israel. Israel kept out of the public eye for the most part, though. He published his writings, but refused to do interviews or public speaking engagements, and he did get requests, lots and lots and lots of them. Over time, he started to experiment with mind-altering substances. Again, not that much different than other people did back in that day. And this led him to the use of LSD in the 1950s. He used it in a laboratory environment under strictly controlled circumstances for the first few years. It's said that he would use it once a year for the rest of his life, but sources are mixed on that, so who knows. This is one of those areas, though, where he and Crowley were not as far from each other's practices as they would think. Crowley had already passed by the time Israel started his experimentation, and Crowley went way further down this rabbit hole than Regardie did, but they still went that route. Even though they were not on good terms when Crowley passed, Israel was the one who began editing and reviewing Crowley's work for publication, even though Crowley had been kind of ignorant to him at one point. Israel may not have been personally okay with the way Crowley ended things with him, but he still defended Crowley, and defended him rather vehemently. For example, one of the first biographies of Crowley after he passed was written by a man named John Simmons. And I've heard of this man. I did not hear a lot of good things about him, and I've looked up this particular book, and I wasn't that impressed by the ratings. He basically was using tabloids to fund most of, from what it looks like, to fund his writing, or just, base all of his stuff on. But the book he wrote was called The Great Beast. Israel was furious at the way Simmons depicted Crowley, justifiably, because he literally, from what I can pick up, and from, I haven't read the book yet, so I can't speak fully on this, but from what I have found of it so far, it looks like he literally read tabloids to write this book. He didn't go through the people who knew Crowley or any of that. He literally just took the most sensational, if it bleeds, it leads, type content to write this book, which, shameful, really. Simmons made Crowley look like a satanic, lecherous old man, only seeking to take care of his prime lusts, not spiritual in the slightest. And this is, in reality, people have their opinions, but I've read a lot of Crowley's work. I've read a lot of his notes, letters. I've researched him massively because he fascinates me. This is so far from the truth, it's actually laughable, because he literally tries to tear this man into shreds, but nothing he said is 100% accurate. Most of it's wrong. And Israel knew this, and so he decided to write his own book to clear things up. Which, I mean, of course he would. He writes everything. The book, though, would take over 10 years to write. And in 1970, and I didn't realize he had done this, so this is a new book to me as well. The book called The Eye in the Triangle, an interpretation of Aleister Crowley, hit the bookshelves in stores. This book was written as a biography from Crowley's birth up until around the time of 1914, which really is the last of Crowley's grand works. He kept writing, he kept experimenting, but his big stuff had already been done by this point. And Israel decided that this was when Crowley had done everything that was important. It talks about the time that Israel had spent with Crowley and how Crowley came to his obsession with the occult. And that is to me what some of the important stuff is, how these people found this. As I spoke in the first video, Israel found this through the study of yoga. And a lot of people find it through different paths, but it's worth looking into their histories, and that's kind of what I'm trying to bring forward here. Israel performed a very delicate task writing this book, because he had to show his appreciation and respect for Crowley, but explain the man's downfall as well, like the stuff that kind of screwed him up. He added many flares towards the psychiatric side as well, because that's what he was studying at the time, going so far as to claim that the spirit that gave Crowley the Book of the Law, Awaz, was actually just a fractured part of Crowley's own psyche that had, mentally divided. I don't quite buy that, because other people have had experiences with some of these entities. I mean, it's possible. Power suggestion is great, but I don't quite know. Israel would know a lot more, because he did sit by that man's side for about 2 years, studying, researching, editing, writing. But there's just a part of me that doesn't quite believe that it's just a psychology concept there, because I've read through the work of when Crowley went through that, and I don't feel that that is truly a fractured psyche. I mean, it could have been, just not quite what I can understand of that. During the time it took Israel to write Crowley's biography, and he wanted to do it right, so it took a lot of time, he actually wrote 2 other books. Pardon me. The one that I have actually read is the 1-year manual. It was originally published as 12, with the title of 12 Steps to Spiritual Enlightenment. It was changed to the 1-year manual later. It is a 12-month guide to magical and spiritual enlightenment, the physical discipline, relaxation techniques, developing concentration, mantra work, and finally touching the awareness of all that is. It is a book that, if you're really wanting to get a jump start kind of a thing on what these practices are, it's a good place to start. It is, again, not as intense as some of the other work that he wrote, but he has it broke down so that you're literally taking 12 months to go through this, and the final achievement, I guess you could call it, is the conscious ability of touching the spirit of all that is. This is not a simple thing of, oh, I had this really spiritual experience. You are connecting in a way that is changing, game changing, life changing, a lot of changing. But it's definitely something, if you are willing to put the work into it, and that's the key to this, the results, the rewards are definitely worth the experience. It's time consuming. It's 12 months. But at that end of the 12 months, you will have experienced a great deal within the spiritual community, or a spiritual experience. So, something to think about. Guess what, though? I just can't pass this part up. The counterculture of the 1960s devoured Israel Regardie's work. Interestingly enough, devoured Aleister Crowley's as well, and totally misinterpreted a whole pile of it. Israel would receive a lot of letters from his readers, some of which were on the side of the unhinged, it is said. There was a footnote in one thing I was researching to kind of clear some questions up, and I ran across this and it made me giggle. He actually collected the letters from the less than stable people and kept them in a manuscript form. I have not been able to find it published yet, but he called it Liber Nuts, Libernuts, for basically this is the law of the crazy type of a thing, or the book of the crazy. And I wish it would have been published at some point, because I could only imagine the stuff that people were sending him, especially in the 60s. Good grief. But people being what they are, and this makes me frustrated. His house was burglarized by people hunting down original manuscripts or items of magic. And soapbox for a second. Items of magic hold their authority through a lineage. So if you're not initiated, it doesn't mean as much to you, first of all. Second of all, stealing an original work just means you have an original work from one of these guys. It doesn't give you any authority. It doesn't give you anything. It is respect of this person that you don't do that. That drove me nuts when I was reading through that. They literally broke into his house twice looking for his paperwork, journals, whatever, Crowley's stuff. He didn't have any, and other than letters, and ritual tools. Okay, it's actually recommended in Golden Dawn specifically, you make your own, because having someone else's doesn't give you any power. Like, come on. Sorry. Anyway, even though he stayed out of the public eye during this time, Israel did make friends with quite a few noble figures in the occult community. A few of them you've heard of, some of you haven't. One of the more popular ones that you may have heard of today was Christopher Hyatt. Has a lot of work on the occult, was really close friends with Regardie. A lot of the work, because I've read a few of Christopher's books as well, and he supports what Regardie was doing, although he took it in a very interesting path. Not bad, just different. Robert Anton Wilson and the Thelemite Grady McMurdy, yeah. And he even made an acquaintance of the drug proponent Timothy Leary. That one kind of surprised me just a little bit, but that's beside the point. Considering who his friends have been through his life, the list above doesn't surprise me personally. I don't recognize all the names, but when I was looking it up, some of the big names were people I'd never heard of, and I've literally been studying in this world for 20 years now. So, but there was a lot of people of notable experience that he knew. Towards the end of his life, though, Israel wrote one of his last works, Ceremonial Magic, A Guide to the Mechanism of Ritual. Published in 1980, this is a guide for ceremonial magicians to walk them through a ritual of self-initiation. The one thing in the big Golden Dawn book is it goes through initiation rituals, but not a full self-initiation. There are texts out there, and I think the Ciceros have one out as well. I didn't link it because I was more focused on this one, because this is actually Regardie's work into it. Because the initiation is not just, I'm joining this group. Spiritual initiation is you're making an agreement with your higher self, your angels and guides, and with Source. This is an agreement. In a lot of the Christian circles, you would call it a baptism back in the day. Today, it's not as binding, and to them, to the mind anyway. But a self-initiation is you are agreeing to take steps. This is what you're doing. And that's why you would take on a ritual name and all the rest of that stuff, because this changes your perspective, your connection to God's source divine energy. So his books to me are very important because they go through a lot of this. But moving forward, sorry, I keep getting distracted. For someone who studied so deeply into Christian mysticism for a fairly large portion of his life, Israel began rejecting all forms of Christianity, including Christian mysticism, Christian science, all of it, towards the end of his life. In the early 1980s, he had come to the belief that Jesus was an allegory for the Egyptian god Osiris. It is what it is. In 1981, Israel began tutoring a woman into the rites of the Golden Dawn. She went on to establish a temple that eventually would split up just like the original one did. But it did influence the writer Gerald Suster, so there was a little bit of influence there, and it was one of the few things that I found that he kind of oopsied on. Usually if he started working with somebody, he knew that they were going to go somewhere with it. Israel would eventually retire from his chiropractic work this around 1981. He moved to Sedona, Arizona. But he kept writing, and his final work, in his words, his magnum opus, was published in 1984. This is the one I spoke of earlier. This is an even more complete version of the original work on the Golden Dawn. This book, The Complete Golden Dawn System of Magic, this is the one I don't have, so I can't say exactly what it looks like, but it looks fascinating to me, is over 1,000 pages long. It has many authors and other teachers referenced in it. It is said that this book was the completion of his life's mission on this planet. Interestingly enough, in 1984, Israel would visit Hawaii, consider moving there, but that wasn't meant to be. While having dinner with friends in a restaurant in Sedona, Israel left us. He died of a heart attack on March 10th of 1985. He lived 77 amazing and very magical years, leaving a legacy that still lives with us today. His money, interestingly enough, went to his nephew, but most of his magical supplies were left to those in the community, but specifically Christopher Hyatt, who went on to establish the Israel Regardie Foundation. I linked that and I linked the website for Israel Regardie Foundation, and I linked the website for the official Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn below, if you want to check those out. Sorry. Israel was married and divorced 3 times, but he never sired a child, which I thought was interesting, to be honest with you. His legacy is his contribution to the occult community and the psychology community. Don't get me wrong, he did a lot there too. One of the most important, if not the most important person in keeping the legacy of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn alive. His writings are the foundation for much of the modern-day Western ceremonial occultism. He preserved the best lineage of the original Golden Dawn from Westcott, Mathers, and Woodman. And I'm going to kind of tie this up, but then I'm going to talk about a little bit of other stuff. This is basically the concluding of this man's amazing life in the world, and to me, one of the most interesting modern-day occultists. There's a lot that's here, and I did not cover everything because, well, I want this to not be a 7-hour series. He had a very unique nature. He was very open about his magic and his healing practices, but he kept his private life very private, which is commendable. What I've discussed here is from various books, various letters, articles that have been written about him, including some random online forums. The one thing that I will say is, if you really want to get to know Israel Regardie, read his work. Practice the exercises. there's a lot of his stuff that's out there. There's a ton that's available. It's like 20 books, give or take. If you really want to understand him at a deeper level, because he puts his heart and soul into these books. The 4 I have right here are 4, I think 12 that I have, because I have, like I said, almost everything he ever wrote. Because it's just, when I was really deep into the research and study part of my journey, he was a consistent one. I literally would just I'd reread his stuff. Like I said, the one, the big text, I haven't gotten all the way through, but I've reread the Middle Pillar probably 7 or 8 times. The Tree of Life is another one when I'm like, I've read it through a couple of times, and then I go back through and research and reference because I can't remember exactly where something was or why you do certain things. It's all there. The Garden of Pomegranates has some amazing meditations that the Ciceros have added. There's just a lot there to work with. So if you really want to start to understand him better, pick up one of his books. Start with The Tree of Life, The Garden of Pomegranates, and The Middle Pillar. Those are the foundational ones in my mind. If you're looking for the occult side of things, the mystic side. If you're wanting just the healing part, pick one of his healing books. That's probably the best way to get to know him. And that's just all I have to say there. He was a very powerful magician. From all accounts, a very jovial person. He loved jokes. And a very accomplished author. And I've linked the Foundation and the Golden Dawn websites below, so you can check that out. Several books down below as well, just so you can find him easier. But in the late 70s, early 80s, 19 part anyway, he move that. That's when he met Sheik or Chick anyway, and Tabitha Cicero. They had developed a lodge in Georgia, and this is just why they're so important to the legacy of Regardie. Because when you look at the bottom of the books, right here, these are the two, Sandra, Tabitha, Cicero. I don't know why I always call her Tabitha. They contacted him in California. They had developed an entire lodge based off of his work, including an initiation chamber, which is for the inner sanctum, the 6, 7, 8, 10, 9, 10 group. Regardie hadn't seen one since he left Europe. They invited him to their temple, their complex there, and I think it was Georgia, might have been Virginia, I can't remember, East Coast. And he goes to this, and he initiates 2 people. It's the only 2 initiations he ever did at that level, but he was also the last living person who had achieved that level through the lineage. There were other people who claimed to have achieved it, but they weren't like direct line. He could direct his line, and that's hugely important. They, over the next 4, 5, 6 years of his life, really stayed in contact with him. Multiple visitations. Matter of fact, they visited him 5 days before he passed, and they said that if they would have known that he was that, things were going that way, they would have stayed, because there was so much respect for him, and he did teach them a lot. That's why they had the privilege of working with some of the annotations, and they started doing some of that while he was alive, but they were able to gain access to all of his notes that Christopher had, his journals and things like that, because even he saw what they were doing and what it could become. So if you ever decide that you want to join a temple, you want to work towards a lodge, finding one that has direct line from the Cicero's group, I think it's the Iris Urata group, that's the one that you want to go with, because that is the lineage of what Regardie worked on. That is the lineage of what Westcott, Woodman, and Mathers started. So there's other groups out there that call themselves the Golden Dawn. I'm not denying that they're not valid in their way, but they're not the original. They're not a line from the original. So, if you are interested in any of that information, it's down below. Questions, comments, suggestions, drop them in the comments section below. Criticisms, as long as you're respectful, let me know. If there's something I can do better, differently, however that works. I was able to scrounge around, and I only could find like 2 pictures that were decent of him. And this one is Israel in his younger days. This was like 1940s-ish. And then this one is the year before he passed. He was, I believe, this was like a meeting with Christopher Hyatt, I believe. Don't quote me on that. I looked at a lot of pictures trying to find something that was usable. But yeah, very fascinating man. Very much one of the people that helped me understand this very interesting, complex, mystical world of ceremonial mysticism and Kabbalah. So maybe it'll help if you're on that journey, or if it's something that's been kind of, maybe it's worth checking out. So with that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in the next video.